Hey YouTube, Ethan here. Today I'm going to discuss preserving your food long term and oxygen not included. I'm going to be discussing two main techniques, one of them being the deep freezing method, and the other one using the dehydrator. We're going to go over the pros and cons of using each method, and how they could be beneficial or a hindrance to your colony. I already have a video on how to build the deep freezing method on my channel, but because it's so easy to do so, we're going to go over that in this tutorial as well. I think it is critical for new players to understand how to preserve your food long term, because running out of food or your food becoming spoiled too quickly is one of the reasons why new players have their colonies die. Not only that, if you're a more experienced player, the deep freezing method is not something that's explicitly explained at any point in the game. It's something that you'd come across sort of by accident, or if you read about it online or watch a video like this one. So I think the more people that have access to the information, the better. And regarding the dehydrator, I think it's very important to look at the pros and cons of it when comparing it to the deep freezing method, so it can help you make a decision on which one to build for your colony. There are obviously certain requirements to build each of them, so if you don't have access to, let's say, a hydrogen vent, you won't be able to build the deep freezing technique in the way that I'm showing you here. However, you can build it in different ways. This deep freezing method that I'm going to show you is not an absolute blueprint on how to build it, but it is certainly one of the easiest ways, in my opinion, to do so. And we'll go over all that when we get to that part of the video. Now, before we get into this, we have to discuss how fast food spoils and what are the different characteristics that increase or decrease the spoilage time. It's actually quite easy to understand, so let's go ahead and jump over here and take a look at some of the different atmospheres that you're going to have in your colony. So the most basic ways that you can store your food is either out in the open, exposed to all the elements, in a ration box, or a refrigerator. Out in the open obviously has absolutely zero benefits. The food is unrefrigerated, and anything above 4 degrees Celsius will spoil more quickly. The ration box itself doesn't actually contribute in any positive way when it comes to food spoilage. The only thing that it really does is forces your duplicants to put the food into a particular place, which then either you can cool or have inside of a certain atmosphere that's going to slow the food spoilage. The refrigerator, on the other hand, does help increase how long your food is going to last for. It says in the information bar that it stores food at the ideal temperature to prevent spoilage. It continues to say that food spoilage can be slowed by ambient conditions as well as refrigerators. If we take a look at the sandbox colony that I use for YouTube tutorials, we can see that the food inside of this refrigerator is not 100% fresh, even though the information tells us that it should be. And if we click on the other refrigerator, we can see that we have a lot of different foods in this one. Some of them have food poisoning, and some of them are even stale. These are eventually going to be inadequate for your duplicants to eat once they reach 0%. And not only that, you probably don't want to feed your duplicants food poisoning because they can get sick, and they will get a slight debuff when they're trying to work. So why doesn't the refrigerator protect our food like it claims that it does? Let's go back over here. This is because there are two criteria in oxygen not included that are going to slow or halt the food spoilage altogether. The first is atmosphere, which I have demonstrated right here in front of us, and the second is temperature, which we'll get to shortly. The refrigerator ticks one of those boxes, but depending on what atmosphere the refrigerator is stored in, it's not going to get any additional buffs to help the food last for longer. And on top of that, the refrigerator also doesn't cool down your food enough in order to stop it from spoiling altogether. Let's go ahead and spawn some more surf and turfs into some of these atmospheres that I have down below. So we have some surf and turf in the regular oxygen atmosphere at 21 degrees, and we can see that it's getting the unrefrigerated debuff, and its freshness is slowly decreasing. In fact, if we take a look at the tooltip, it's minus 25% cycle, 18% for being unrefrigerated, and minus 8% for being in a normal atmosphere. So obviously one of the major contributors to having your food spoil very quickly is being unrefrigerated. So that's where the refrigerator really comes in handy. But as you can see on this debuff, that the atmosphere also contributes to it as well. There are multiple different types of atmospheres that are going to provide a sterile environment for your food. The most popular ones are hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and chlorine. You can see that the surf and turf that is dropped inside the chlorine is unrefrigerated, so it's still getting that debuff for being unrefrigerated, but it's in a sterile atmosphere. The sterile atmosphere will make sure that this food will never contact any germs, and it's going to take away that minus 8% debuff or cycle for keeping your food fresh. And you can see that this hydrogen gas is 26 degrees Celsius, so the temperature is completely separate from the sterile environment buff that your food is getting. Inside the carbon dioxide, which is also about 26 degrees, we can see that the surf and turf is once again getting the sterile environment buff, and it's going to decay 8% slower than it would if it was in regular oxygen. The last is chlorine gas. It's also around 25-26 degrees, and just like the hydrogen and carbon dioxide, it's also getting the sterile atmosphere buff. So no matter what gas you use to try to preserve your food, all three of these are going to provide you with a buff to help your food last longer. This means that if you combine the atmosphere, such as carbon dioxide, with something like the ration box, it's going to increase the shelf life of the food, which is a great method early on when you don't have access to a lot of power in order to build something like the refrigerator or the deep freezing method. One of the simplest ways you could do this is by putting the ration box at the very bottom of your base and having your duplicants deliver all the food into that ration box. Now you can do the same thing for refrigerators. On the other hand, in this chamber we have polluted oxygen at around 25 degrees Celsius, and we can see that the surf and turf is getting a pollution exposure debuff. This is causing its freshness per cycle to change by minus 43%, minus 18% for being unrefrigerated, and minus 25% for being in a contaminated environment. So this is just one of the many reasons why you don't want to have polluted oxygen flowing all over your base. Even if you don't have a lot of it, it's going to linger around, and if it settles on a tile, or if it's just passing by the tile that your refrigerator or ration box is on, it's going to increase the spoil rate of your food. Since I've been talking in this tutorial, the surf and turf in all the sterile atmospheres is at 90%, and the surf and turf that's in the polluted oxygen is 75%. So you can see that there's a clear winner here in helping your food stay fresh for the longest periods of time. So let's take a look at temperatures. We're going to be using hydrogen gas for this demonstration because it's going to provide us with a sterile environment. And we're going to spot in some surf and turf. On the far right, we have hydrogen gas at 20 degrees Celsius. And we've already seen from above what happens when the surf and turf is in this environment. It's getting the unrefrigerated debuff, but it's in a sterile environment, so its freshness rating is only changing by negative 18% per cycle. In the middle here, we're simulating a refrigerator. The atmosphere in here is around minus 5 degrees Celsius, so it's simulating refrigeration, and it's also in a sterile atmosphere. The refrigeration happens when the temperature is below 4 degrees Celsius, which means its freshness rating per cycle is only going to change by minus 5 degrees Celsius, minus 5 for being refrigerated, and 0% for being in a sterile atmosphere. So this surf and turf is going to last significantly longer than the surf and turf on the right side. Now let's head over to the far left. This hydrogen gas is minus 66 degrees Celsius, a drastic difference from the other two. This surf and turf is getting the deep freeze buff and the sterile environment atmosphere buff. This means that its freshness rating per cycle changes by 0%, meaning this food will last forever. If you're able to store your food in a cold biome and with carbon dioxide early on in your playthrough, you can literally have food that will last for your entire game. Now obviously this is much more practical for something like surf and turf because surf and turf takes a lot of ingredients and duplicate labor in order to produce. So you don't want all that effort going into waste by having this food spoil. Lastly, a much more practical application would be storing your food in a refrigerator or a ration box in a very cold and sterile environment. So this is just combining what we've just talked about and showing how food freshness is affected by storing your food inside of a refrigerator or a ration box with the atmospheres and temperatures that we just discussed. In the refrigerator, we have surf and turf at 84% freshness, and this food is refrigerated and inside of a sterile environment despite being inside of the refrigerator. So it only has a negative 5% per cycle change when it comes to its freshness rating. So you can combine an atmosphere with the refrigerator and have your food last a lot longer than it normally would. And this is the same for the ration box. This ration box is deep frozen and it's in a sterile atmosphere. So the surf and turf that's in here at negative 20 degrees Celsius is 100% fresh and it will never go bad as long as I'm able to maintain the sterile environment and the temperature. So that about sums it up on how you can impact your food longevity in oxygen not included. So let's go over how we can build some infrastructure in order to help us achieve preserving our food long term. So first of all, let's discuss the dehydrator. The dehydrator is a lot less labor intensive to build because all you have to do is build the dehydrator itself and the rehydrator in order to eat the food once it's dehydrated. This doesn't take a lot of power. The rehydrator itself only takes 60 watts of power. However, it does have a water requirement, whereas the rehydrator doesn't require any power at all, but it does have a natural gas requirement. It's also worth noting that the dehydrator requires you to use plastic in order to dehydrate your food, and that's the same no matter what food you're trying to dehydrate. All the foods are going to require plastic as a second ingredient. You're also going to be required to have 6,000 kcals of whatever food that you're trying to dehydrate. Anything below that and you're not going to be able to dehydrate it. Now, no matter what food you're dehydrating, it's going to create 6 kilograms of water that's going to fall beneath the dehydrator. So this is the purpose of this pit, is to collect the water and send it back into the rehydrator. As you can see, most of this can be automated by using an auto sweeper that can pick up the plastic and put the surf and turf inside of the dehydrator, but a duplicant inevitably has to come by and finish the process. Then the auto sweeper can restart the process on its own. The rehydrator itself will store 5 kilograms of whatever dried food that you have, and your duplicants can take it from here when it comes time to eat it. So that's the dehydrator and rehydrator combo setup in a nutshell. Although I think there are definitely uses to the dehydrator, the fact that it's just so slow and that it requires plastic in order for you to use is a major downside. Now, plastic can be relatively easy to come by if you have a glossy Dreco farm, or if you have a constant production of oil that you can turn into plastic using the polymer press. But I think this is a lot of effort to go through just to use the dehydrator. It also requires natural gas, although not too much of it, and overall you can kind of see how slow this process is. Not only is the process slow, but it requires duplicates to come by every now and then in order to finish the dehydration. Like I said, I do think there are uses for this if you have a very particular build in your colony that you're trying to achieve, such as maybe space missions or delivering food to other asteroids. But as far as protecting and preserving your food for a single colony, I think there's only really one method to go by, and that's deep freezing it. So let's go ahead and go over deep freezing and how it works. So we already know that deep freezing requires the food to be negative 18 degrees Celsius or lower. In this case, I have this set up at negative 26 degrees Celsius, and I can adjust it using my thermosensor that's inside of the storage chamber. In your colony, what you would probably have is a chute over here that's going to drop your food into the deep frozen chamber. And this tiny little liquid lock allows your duplicants to pick up the food from here and eat it. Now ideally, you'd have this set up right next to your grate hall, like I do here. This allows your duplicants to come and pick up the food right away when they want to eat inside of the grate hall. This is going to limit how much time they have to spend traveling to pick up their food when it's break time. And ideally, you'd also have it very close to your kitchen, so as your food is traveling over the conveyor rails, it doesn't have a lot of opportunity to become less fresh. You can see that the stuffed berry that I have stored in here, along with the cooked seafood, is 98% fresh. And this is because the food loses 2% freshness from the kitchen when it goes through the conveyor rail into my deep storage chamber. Of course, you can limit this by freezing it during the conveyor rail process, which is totally viable. You could have an entire chamber coming right out of your kitchen in order to freeze the food, so it doesn't lose that 2% freshness. But I decided to forego that because I don't mind losing the 2%. Anyways, back to the example below. Obviously, in order for this to work correctly, we have to have some sort of atmosphere that's sterile, like we talked about earlier. And in this case, it's hydrogen gas. The hydrogen gas not only helps keep this room cool, but it also provides the sterile buff for the food. And when that's combined with the deep frozen state, it's going to prevent the food from going bad altogether. So let's drop in some surf and turf and see what happens. As you can see, immediately upon being dropped in, the surf and turf is in a deep frozen state and a sterile environment, which means it will never go bad. Let's go ahead and talk about how we're maintaining this temperature. This is very easy if you have access to an anti-entropy thermal nullifier, or as I like to call it, an AETN. Of course, if you have an AETN, you're going to need a hydrogen vent as well in order to supply the hydrogen needed to get this to work. The thermal sensor controls the gas shutoff, and that's how we're going to regulate the temperature. The hydrogen gas comes out from the hydrogen vent, it gets sucked up by the gas pump, which then goes into the AETN. However, the AETN doesn't use that much hydrogen at all. Most of it is going to bypass the AETN and go on to this gas bridge, which is going to send the hydrogen through a snaking radiant gas pipe that's going to cool the hydrogen before it leaves this chamber. The cooling is done by the AETN itself. The AETN requires 10 grams per second of hydrogen, and it requires no power whatsoever. It works by cooling the surrounding area, so if you enclose it inside of a chamber that's also filled with hydrogen gas, you can get some insane cooling out of it. In this case, it's been running for a while, and it's negative 173 degrees Celsius. So all of the hydrogen gas that's snaking through this pipe is going to leave this chamber at roughly the same temperature. We'll explain the other piping in a minute. Then I have it going through ceramics insulated pipes until it gets to my deep frozen chamber. From there, it gets stopped by the gas shutoff, so it transfers all of that cooling into this small little chamber, which of course is also filled with hydrogen. Because I'm constantly going to be dropping new food in here, this thermosensor is going to eventually heat up and send a green signal to the gas shutoff to open it up and allow more very cold hydrogen to come in here and remove some of that heat. This keeps the chamber at the necessary temperature to keep whatever food is inside here in a deep frozen state. Now, it's important to understand that this cannot be a vacuum. It has to be inside of an atmosphere, such as hydrogen, carbon dioxide, or chlorine. But if you're using something like the AETN, which provides massive amounts of cooling, you can very easily freeze whatever atmosphere is in here. For example, carbon dioxide and chlorine are going to freeze a lot sooner than hydrogen. So if you're getting down to extreme levels of cooling, it's going to break this atmosphere by freezing it and break this liquid lock. So I suggest using hydrogen so you don't run into that problem. The liquid lock should also be tolerant to extreme temperatures. Obviously, you cannot use water because it's going to reach negative temperatures very quickly, and water is going to freeze and break the liquid lock. So you have to use something like ethanol, oil, or petroleum. In my case, ethanol will freeze at negative 114 degrees Celsius, which I think is more than enough to keep this deep freezing chamber working indefinitely. It's also important to note that the food itself doesn't have to be minus 18 degrees Celsius in order for it to be in a deep frozen state. As long as the atmosphere is negative 18 degrees Celsius or lower, whatever food is dropped in here will immediately become deep frozen. So now that we know how this works, let's go ahead and talk about the rest of the piping. The rest of the piping that I have going on here is a little bit extra, and not entirely needed, but it's going to help you maintain the temperatures of your AETN for a lot longer. So our very first challenge is going to be taming the hydrogen vent. Now I spawned this hydrogen vent in using sandbox mode, so I also have to spawn in the hydrogen that's surrounding it. But when the hydrogen vent is working, it's going to produce hydrogen at 500 degrees Celsius. And obviously, if you have a gas pump built out of steel, it's going to melt incredibly quickly. Luckily for us, hydrogen is incredibly easy to cool down, and you can use water or the hydrogen itself if you have the AETN close by. Let's go ahead and take another look at how you can tame a hydrogen vent, just in case you don't have an AETN nearby. In this scenario, I have a hydrogen vent that's being cooled by water and metal tiles. When the hydrogen vent expels the hydrogen at 500 degrees Celsius, it has to travel down this path, which is cooled by the 40-degree metal tiles. When the liquid pipe thermosensors detect that the water here gets too hot, it's going to open up this liquid shutoff and bring in more cold water in order to keep cooling this chamber. So by the time the hydrogen gets to this gas pump, which is built out of gold amalgam, it's going to be cold enough to not destroy the gas pump. In this case, I'm doing the exact same thing, but I'm cooling the hydrogen gas using the hydrogen that's coming from the AETN. The hydrogen gets pumped out of this chamber by the gas pump, and it's going to go in to feed the AETN. But it's also going to branch off and get very cold before it goes back into the gas chamber with the hydrogen vent in order to cool the hydrogen that's about to be consumed by the gas pump. Now obviously this is bricked because the hydrogen isn't moving very much. And this can be alleviated in a regular playthrough by using the hydrogen in other areas of your playthrough, such as hydrogen generators. But if you have a closed loop scenario like the sandbox mode, obviously the hydrogen has nowhere to go because there's no purpose for it. So if you do happen to copy this technique, just make sure that you keep the hydrogen flowing through here so it doesn't get stopped, because otherwise it's going to heat up inside this pipe and never move forward. Even though this method is slightly viable in this tutorial, I still highly recommend using water as I just showed you in the previous technique, because it's going to provide a lot more cooling to the hydrogen than hydrogen gas itself. But regardless, let's move past that. The hydrogen goes into the AETN and then it gets branched off into a liquid bridge. And the only purpose for this liquid bridge is just to control the flow of gases, because as you can see, I have another gas bridge that's tied to it as well. So if we follow the flow, it goes through the radiant gas pipes and it ends up going to the gas shutoff. Right behind the gas shutoff is a gas pipe thermal sensor, which is set to send the green signal if the temperature inside the pipe is below 20 degrees Celsius. That means that once the gas is cooled sufficiently, it's going to continue along this insulated gas pipe made out of ceramic into your deep freezing chamber. Now it's worth noting that even though ceramic is one of the best insulators, it's still going to lose a lot of temperature if your run is long enough. So you can see here that the hydrogen gas leaves at roughly negative 155 degrees Celsius, and as it makes its way along the pipe, it enters the deep frozen chamber at negative 85 degrees Celsius. Now this is more than enough to deep freeze your food, but if your run is very long because your AETN is very far away from your kitchen or your grate hall, this is going to lose a significant amount of cooling potential before it gets to your deep frozen chamber. There are several things that you can do in order to mitigate this, including putting this insulated pipe inside a ceramic enclosure made out of insulated tiles, or having it run inside of a vacuum. Another thing that will help keep this hydrogen cold, which is far more labor intensive, is actually using it somewhere else in your base. So you could tap off of this point and have it go into a hydrogen generator, just so there's always a constant flow of hydrogen, which is going to keep the hydrogen inside of this gas pipe a lot colder for a lot longer. It's all about keeping the gas flow moving, because if it gets stagnant, it's eventually going to heat up over time. Once the gas gets hot enough inside of the deep frozen chamber, the gas shutoff is going to turn on. It's going to send the hot gas through back into the hydrogen vent chamber. From here on, it will provide ambient cooling to whatever hydrogen is coming out of the vent, and it's eventually going to get sucked back up by the gas pump. Anything that is not cold enough at the first gas shutoff inside of the AETN chamber is routed back into the chamber itself to continue cooling. Once again, the gas bridge is only in here in order to keep the gas flow in one direction at this intersection. If I didn't have this gas bridge or this gas bridge, the gas would not flow properly through this piping, and I would have to rebuild the entire system. That's also the purpose for this gas bridge inside of the hydrogen vent chamber. Although it's not really related to deep freezing, let's go ahead and try something. I added a high pressure gas vent into my gas piping to keep the hydrogen moving like it would in a real colony. So now you can see how the gas is constantly flowing through the chamber as it should. This is going to continue to bring cold hydrogen through this pipe where the hydrogen vent is. So let's go ahead and simulate this hydrogen vent erupting. We're going to put in 500-degree hydrogen gas into this vent. And as you can see, it gets cold right away because the hydrogen coming from the AETN has already been cooling the metal pipe, which is taking away a lot of the heat from the hydrogen gas. And this hydrogen gas inside the pipe is also keeping the gas pump from overheating, so it can continue to pump the gas into the AETN. We can continue brushing in more heat into the hydrogen to continue this simulation. Ultimately, the gas pump does get very hot, and there is a potential for it to overheat. So once again, I highly recommend the method as shown here, because this provides a lot more reliable cooling than trying to use hydrogen itself to cool the hydrogen vent. Of course, you could also combine the two. Water is just far more superior to cooling the hydrogen than any type of gas will ever be. Let's do a recap and go over the pros and cons of both methods of food preservation. The dehydrator takes very little power and only natural gas in order to build. It's very easy to set up in that sense. The rehydrator only takes water and power. This makes the dehydrator extremely useful for delivering foods to different colonies on different asteroids, especially if you have an excessive amount of food production and you have enough time in order to dehydrate the food and send it on your space missions. The major downside to the dehydrator is that it takes so long, so it's not really viable if you're only dehydrating the food for your current colony, or the colony on the asteroid where your dehydrator is. Also, when it comes to sending food into deep space missions or to other asteroids, I highly recommend using the berry sludge instead. I just did a tutorial on how I built my berry sludge farm and how I keep my temperatures very cold, which keeps my sleet wheat growing at maximum uptime in order to produce a lot of berry sludge for my colony. Berry sludge is not affected by any type of atmosphere or any type of temperature. It's never going to spoil. It's the only food in the game that has a +8 morale rating and will never go bad for your duplicants. You can literally put this anywhere and it will stay fresh forever. But if I'm trying to preserve my food long term for the duplicants on my current asteroid, I'm either going to be using the berry sludge or the deep freezing method. The deep freezing method can be achieved by using the aqua tuner steam turbine combo as well, so if you don't have access to the anti-entropy thermal nullifier or a hydrogen vent, you could apply more power and use the aqua tuner steam turbine combo, which I also have a video on that you can go check out to see how you build it. But obviously the least power intensive way in order to build it is by using something that requires no power at all. And the only way that this method can break is if your liquid lock breaks. So you just have to keep an eye on your temperature and make sure that the ethanol, oil, or petroleum that you're using here never freezes. And your food will stay fresh forever. Another major upside to this, like I showed you earlier in the video, is that you can put the deep freezing station right beside of your Great Hall, so when duplicants are coming over for their meal, they can simply grab it from this chamber without having to go very far to get their food. Let me know down in the comments below what you think. Have you ever built a dehydrator and have you found any viable uses for it? Obviously, I'd love to know your feedback because maybe I'm just not seeing something that other people have already experienced in the game. So if you do know any methods, please let me know down in the comments below. Also, if you made it this far in the video, it would mean a lot to me if you left a rating. It helps me a ton in the algorithm to get the video out to more people. And of course, if you're not subscribed, be sure to do so you get more videos like these in the future on your homepage. And as always, I can't end the video without thanking the subscribers that have gotten me to where I am now. I'm just a small-time YouTuber that does this for a hobby, but it's overwhelming to see the positive feedback that I get on these videos, and I'm so glad that you guys enjoy the content that I put out. So thank you very much for leaving kind feedback and for being subscribers to the channel. And until the next video, I'm Ethan, and I'll see you guys in the next one.